The stagecoach wheels ground to a halt in front of the Carson City depot, and Grace Kellerman stepped out into a world so cold and unforgiving that her breath turned to ice crystals before her eyes. It was January 1883, and the Nevada winter had descended upon the high desert town with unexpected ferocity, transforming the dusty streets into rivers of frozen mud and coating every surface with a brittle layer of frost. She clutched her threadbare coat tighter around her shoulders, the fabric doing little to shield her from the biting wind that swept down from the Sierra Nevada mountains, and felt the full weight of her decision pressing down upon her like the leaden sky above. Grace had traveled nearly 2,000 miles from Boston, leaving behind the cramped tenement where her mother had died of consumption the previous autumn, leaving behind the factory work that had bent her fingers into permanent curves, leaving behind everything she had ever known for the promise of a new life with a man she had never met. The letters from Lincoln Quincy had been kind enough, written in a steady hand that spoke of a ranch outside town, of honest work and honest living, of a need for a wife who could manage a home while he managed the land. She had responded to his advertisement in the matrimonial newspaper with equal parts desperation and hope. And now here she stood, 22 years old and utterly alone, waiting for a stranger who held her entire future in his calloused hands. The depot was little more than a weathered building with peeling paint, and the few people who had braved the cold to meet the stage hurried about their business with heads bent against the wind. Grace scanned the faces, looking for someone who might be looking for her, but saw only strangers who cast brief, indifferent glances her way before moving on. Minutes passed, then an hour, and still no one came. Her feet had gone numb inside her worn boots, and her hands shook so badly that she could barely keep hold of her single carpetbag, which contained everything she owned in the world. Fear settled into her bones alongside the cold, a creeping dread that whispered terrible possibilities. Perhaps Lincoln Quincy had changed his mind upon seeing her, finding her too plain or too poor or simply not what he had imagined. Perhaps he had forgotten the date of her arrival. Perhaps something had happened to him, and she was now stranded in a town where she knew no one, with barely enough money for a single night's lodging and no means of returning east. The sun was beginning its descent toward the mountains, and Grace knew that when darkness fell, the temperature would drop even further. She was considering whether to spend her precious few coins on a room at the boarding house across the street when she heard the sound of hoofbeats on the frozen ground. A rider appeared through the swirling snow that had just begun to fall, sitting tall in the saddle atop a sturdy bay horse. He dismounted with the easy grace of someone who had spent more time on horseback than on foot, and Grace saw that he was a man in his late 20s with dark hair that curled slightly beneath his hat and eyes the color of summer sky, startlingly blue against his weathered skin. He looked directly at her, and something in his expression made her heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with fear. He approached with purposeful strides, stopping a respectful distance away, and removed his hat. "Miss Kellerman." His voice was deep and steady, carrying easily over the wind. Grace could only nod, her voice frozen somewhere in her chest along with everything else. "I am Lincoln Quincy," he said, and she saw genuine concern cross his features as he took in her shivering form. "I apologize for being late. One of my horses broke through ice at the creek this morning, and it took considerable time to get her out and settled. You must be half frozen standing here." He moved closer, and she caught the scent of leather and pine and something warm that might have been his own natural smell. "Let me get you to the ranch straight away. We can talk on the way." He reached for her carpetbag, and his fingers brushed hers for the briefest moment. Even through her gloves, She felt the warmth of that touch like a spark of life in the frozen wasteland her body had become. Lincoln secured her bag to his saddle, then turned back to her with an expression of gentle determination. "I know this is not how you imagined things would begin," he said quietly. "And I know you have every reason to be frightened. But I want you to understand something right now before we go any further." He looked directly into her eyes, and the intensity of his gaze made her forget the cold for a heartbeat. "Fear ends at my door. Whatever you have been through, whatever worries you carry, you are safe now. I made a promise in my letters, and I intend to keep it. You will want for nothing at my ranch, and no harm will come to you there." The words themselves were simple enough, but the way he spoke them, with absolute conviction and quiet strength, made something crack inside Grace's frozen shell. Tears sprang to her eyes, hot against her icy cheeks, and she found her voice at last. "Thank you," she whispered. "I was beginning to think nobody was coming." "I will always come," Lincoln said simply. "Now let us get you warm before this weather gets any worse." He helped her mount his horse with careful hands that steadied her when she swayed with cold and exhaustion, then swung up behind her. Grace had never been this close to a man who was not her father, and certainly never pressed against one as Lincoln was pressed against her now, his arms coming around her to hold the reins. She should have felt uncomfortable or improper, but instead she felt only the blessed warmth of his body seeping through the layers of clothing, and the solid strength of him at her back like a wall against the wind. They rode through Carson City's Main Street, passing the assay office and the general store, and the saloon from which lamplight and raucous laughter spilled out into the gathering dusk. Grace had a confused impression of wooden buildings and rutted streets and faces that peered out from windows. But mostly, she was aware only of Lincoln's steady presence and the gradual return of feeling to her extremities, which brought with it a painful tingling sensation. Beyond the town, they followed a road that climbed into rolling hills dotted with sagebrush and juniper. The snow was falling more heavily now, and Grace could barely see more than a few yards ahead, but Lincoln guided the horse with confidence, clearly knowing every inch of this land. After what felt like both an eternity and no time at all, they crested a rise and Grace saw lights glowing in the distance. Lincoln's ranch was larger than she had expected, with a sprawling house built of logs and stone, a massive barn, and several outbuildings arranged around a central yard. Smoke rose from the chimney, promising warmth inside, and Grace felt something in her chest loosen slightly at the sight. This was real. This was going to be her home. Lincoln helped her down from the horse with the same careful courtesy he had shown at the depot, and she stumbled slightly when her feet touched the ground, legs unsteady after the long ride. He steadied her immediately, his hands firm on her arms. "Easy now," he murmured. "Let us get you inside." He led her up the steps to the front door, which swung open before they reached it. An older woman stood in the doorway, round-faced and motherly, with gray hair tucked beneath a neat cap. Her expression of stern disapproval melted into concern when she saw Grace. "Lord have mercy, Lincoln. The poor girl looks half dead with cold. Bring her in at once." The warmth of the house hit Grace like a physical thing, so overwhelming after the hours of cold that she swayed again. Lincoln guided her to a chair near the large fireplace that dominated one wall of the main room, and the older woman bustled over with blankets that she wrapped around Grace's shoulders with practiced efficiency. "Miss Kellerman, this is Martha Hayes," Lincoln said. "She has been helping me manage the household since my parents passed. Martha, this is Grace, who has had a very difficult journey and needs hot food and rest more than anything else." "Of course she does," Martha said briskly, but her hands were gentle as she helped Grace remove her damp coat and boots. Poor lamb, coming all this way to find yourself freezing at a depot. Lincoln told me about the horse, but still, it must have been frightening for you. She fixed Lincoln with a sharp look. You should have sent word to town somehow. I know, Lincoln said quietly. I made a mistake in judgment, thinking I could free the mare and still make it to town on time. He looked at Grace, and she saw real regret in his eyes. I am truly sorry. Grace found herself wanting to reassure him, which was absurd given that she was the one who had suffered. But there was something in his manner, in the genuine nature of his apology, that made her believe he had not been careless or indifferent. The horse, she said softly. Is she all right? Something flickered in Lincoln's expression, surprise perhaps, or appreciation. She will be. My foreman is with her in the barn, making sure she stays warm and calm. It was foolish of me to let her near that part of the creek, but the cold has been so fierce that I did not expect the ice to have spread so far. Martha returned with a cup of something hot that steamed in the firelight, and Grace wrapped her hands around it gratefully. The first sip revealed it to be beef broth, rich and salty, and she felt warmth begin to spread through her from the inside. She drank slowly, aware of Lincoln and Martha watching her with concerned eyes, and gradually the shaking in her hands began to subside. The room around her came into clearer focus as life returned to her frozen senses. It was a good-sized space, clearly the main living area of the house, with sturdy furniture that showed signs of care and use. The walls were decorated with simple items: a rifle above the mantel, a few framed photographs, a clock that ticked steadily on one wall. Everything was clean and well-maintained, speaking of a household run with attention and pride. It was nothing like the elegant homes she had sometimes glimpsed in Boston's wealthier neighborhoods, but it was infinitely better than the cramped, damp rooms she had left behind. I have made up the room at the end of the hall for you, Martha said, breaking the silence. It has its own small stove, and I have been keeping it warm all day in anticipation of your arrival. Once you have finished that broth, I will show you up and you can rest. Dinner will not be ready for another hour at least, which should give you time to thaw properly. Grace finished the broth and allowed Martha to lead her up a narrow staircase to the second floor. The room she was shown to was small but comfortable, with a bed covered in quilts, a washstand with a pitcher and basin, a chest of drawers, and the promised stove that radiated gentle heat. A window looked out over the darkening landscape, though there was nothing to see now but swirling snow. There are some dresses in the chest that belonged to Lincoln's mother, Martha said. She was about your size, I think, and they are just sitting unused. Lincoln said you should feel free to wear them if they suit you. She paused in the doorway. He is a good man, my dear. I know this situation must seem strange and frightening, but I promise you that you have come to a good home. Left alone, Grace sank onto the bed and felt the events of the day crash over her like a wave. She had done it. She had actually traveled across the country to marry a stranger, and now here she was in Nevada, in a rancher's house, with her entire future an unknown country stretching before her. The fear she had been holding at bay threatened to overwhelm her, but then she remembered Lincoln's words at the depot. Fear ends at my door. She wanted to believe that. She wanted it so desperately that it made her chest ache. Grace washed her face and hands in the basin, gasping at the sensation of warm water on her still cold skin, then examined the contents of the chest. Inside were several dresses in simple but good fabrics, clearly made by someone who knew how to sew. She chose one in a deep green wool that looked practical and warm, and changed out of her travel-stained clothing with relief. The dress fit reasonably well, perhaps a bit loose in places, but infinitely better than anything she owned. When she descended the stairs an hour later, following the sound of voices and the smell of cooking food, she found Lincoln and Martha in the large kitchen adjacent to the main room. A man she had not seen before sat at the table, older than Lincoln by perhaps a decade, with weathered features and hair going gray at the temples. All three looked up when she entered. Lincoln rose immediately, and his eyes swept over her in a way that made her suddenly conscious of her appearance. "The dress suits you," he said. "The color is very fine." Then, as if remembering himself, he gestured to the other man. "This is James Porter, my foreman. He has been with me since I started the ranch 5 years ago. James, this is Miss Grace Kellerman." James stood and nodded respectfully. "Pleased to meet you, miss. Welcome to the Quincy Ranch." They sat down to a dinner of beef stew, fresh bread, and preserved vegetables from the root cellar. Grace ate hungrily, having had nothing since a dry biscuit on the stagecoach that morning, and the food was simple but delicious. The conversation flowed around her as Lincoln and James discussed ranch matters, the escaped horse and the condition of the herd, and the supplies they would need to order from town once the weather cleared. Martha interjected occasionally with comments about the household, and Grace mostly listened, trying to get a sense of the rhythm of this new life. Lincoln included her in the conversation whenever he could, asking about her journey and whether the room was to her liking, but he did not press her when her answers were brief. Grace appreciated his consideration more than she could express. She was so tired that forming coherent thoughts felt like wading through deep water, and the warmth of the fire and the food in her belly were combining to make her eyelids heavy. "You must be exhausted," Lincoln said gently when he noticed her stifling a yawn. "Please do not feel you need to stay up on our account. Tomorrow will be soon enough for us to discuss the practical matters of our arrangement." Grace nodded gratefully and excused herself, climbing the stairs on legs that felt like lead. She fell into the bed still wearing the borrowed dress, too tired to change, and was asleep within moments of her head touching the pillow. She woke in darkness to the sound of wind howling around the house and the soft ticking of snow against her window. For a moment she could not remember where she was, and panic surged through her until memory returned. Nevada, Carson City, Lincoln, Quincy. She was in her new home, or what was supposed to become her home once she and Lincoln were married. Grace rose and went to the window, peering out into the night. The storm had intensified, and snow was falling so thickly that she could barely see the outline of the barn. This was nothing like the winters she had known in Boston, where snow fell on streets that were quickly cleared and people hurried from building to building through the cold. Here, there was a wildness to the weather, a sense that nature was not something to be managed but merely endured. She climbed back into bed and pulled the quilts up to her chin, listening to the wind and thinking about the man sleeping somewhere else in this house. Lincoln Quincy was not what she had expected, though she was not entirely sure what she had expected. His letters had been practical and straightforward, laying out the facts of his situation and what he could offer, asking about her skills and her health, and whether she could manage a frontier household. She had imagined someone older perhaps, or someone harder, worn down by the difficulties of life on a ranch. Instead, she had found a man who seemed thoughtful and considerate, who apologized when he made mistakes and who cared enough about his horse to risk being late meeting her. He was also handsome in a rough, outdoors way that made her stomach flutter strangely when he looked at her. Grace had never been courted properly, having spent her youth working to help support her mother, and she had little experience with men beyond the foreman at the factory and the rough men who lived in her neighborhood. Lincoln was something different entirely, and she did not quite know what to make of him or of the way his presence made her feel. She fell back asleep eventually, and when she woke again, it was to pale morning light filtering through the curtains and the smell of coffee drifting up from below. Grace dressed in another of the borrowed dresses, this one a practical brown calico, and braided her dark hair, wishing she had a mirror to check her appearance. Then she made her way downstairs, following the sounds of activity. Martha was in the kitchen, kneading bread dough with strong, practiced motions. She looked up and smiled when Grace entered. "Good morning, dear. I hope you slept well. Coffee is on the stove and there are biscuits warming in the oven. The men are out tending to the animals, but they will be back shortly for breakfast." Grace poured herself coffee and sat at the table, cradling the warm mug in her hands. Through the window she could see that the storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed by snow. Everything was white and pristine and beautiful in the early light, and for the first time since leaving Boston, Grace felt a small flutter of something that might have been hope. "Martha," she said hesitantly, "may I ask you something?" "Of course, dear." "What is Lincoln really like?" "I mean, I have only his letters to judge by, and I know that people can present themselves differently in writing than they are in person." Martha paused in her kneading and looked at Grace with kind eyes. "That is a fair question, and you deserve an honest answer. Lincoln is one of the best men I have ever known, and I do not say that lightly. He is honest, hardworking, and fair in his dealings. He does not drink to excess or gamble or frequent the saloons the way many men do. He built this ranch from almost nothing after his parents died, working dawn to dusk for years to make it profitable." She resumed kneading, her hands working the dough with rhythmic efficiency. "He is also lonely, though he would never admit it. His parents passed within months of each other 3 years ago, leaving him with land and cattle but no family. He throws himself into work to avoid thinking about it, but a ranch is no substitute for human connection. That is why he finally placed that advertisement, I think. Not just because he needed help with the household, but because he needed someone to share his life with." Grace absorbed this, turning it over in her mind. Did he love someone before, someone who broke his heart? No, nothing like that. He was engaged once, years ago when his parents were still alive, to a girl from town. But she decided she did not want the isolation of ranch life and married a merchant instead. Lincoln was hurt, but I do not think it was a deep love, more of an arrangement that seemed practical at the time. Since then, he has been too busy building this place to court anyone properly. The door opened and Lincoln entered, stamping snow from his boots. His cheeks were flushed with cold and his eyes were bright. He saw Grace at the table and smiled, and something in her chest warmed in response. "Good morning," he said. "I hope you slept well despite the storm." "I did, thank you, and thank you for the dresses. It was very kind of you to offer them." "They are yours now," Lincoln said firmly. "My mother would have been happy to know they were being put to good use." He poured himself coffee and sat across from her at the table. "Grace, I think we should discuss the practical aspects of our arrangement. I do not want there to be any misunderstandings between us." Grace nodded, her heart beginning to beat faster. Here it was, the conversation that would determine the shape of her new life. Lincoln wrapped his hands around his mug, his expression serious. "I proposed marriage to you in my letters, and I stand by that proposal. However, I do not expect you to marry me immediately, not after knowing me for barely a day. What I suggest is this: we should take some time to get to know each other properly. You can live here as a member of the household, helping Martha with the domestic work if you are willing, and we can see if we suit each other. If after a few months you decide that you do not wish to marry me, I will give you money for passage back east or wherever you wish to go, with no hard feelings. Grace stared at him, surprised. "You would do that? Let me leave even after bringing me all this way?" "I brought you here with a proposal, not a demand," Lincoln said quietly. "I will not force you into marriage, Grace. That would be wrong, and it would make both of us miserable. Marriage should be a partnership between equals, not a prison." He met her eyes steadily. "I meant what I said yesterday. Fear ends at my door. That includes fear of being trapped in a situation you do not want." Something shifted inside Grace, a wall she had not even known she was holding beginning to crumble. "Thank you," she said softly. "That means more to me than you could possibly know." She took a breath. "But I should tell you that I do not want to return east. There is nothing for me there anymore. My mother was the last of my family, and when she died, that part of my life ended. I came here hoping to build something new, and I would like to try." Lincoln's expression softened. "Then we will try together. And if we find that we suit each other well enough, we can be married in the spring when the weather is better and we can have a proper ceremony." He paused. "I should also tell you that I will expect nothing from you in terms of, well, marital relations until after we are properly wed. You have your room and I have mine, and that is how it will remain. Martha is here as chaperone, and there will be no impropriety under my roof." Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks, but she appreciated his directness. "I understand. Thank you for being clear about that." James came in then, followed by two other men Grace had not met, ranch hands who lived in the bunkhouse. Martha served breakfast, and the conversation turned to the work that needed to be done that day. Grace listened and learned that running a ranch was a constant cycle of tending animals, maintaining buildings and fences, managing supplies, and preparing for the changing seasons. It sounded like hard work, but honest work, and she found herself wanting to be part of it. After breakfast, Martha showed Grace around the house properly, explaining the routines and systems that kept everything running smoothly. There was washing to be done, meals to prepare, cleaning and mending, and 1,000 small tasks that filled the days. Grace had worked hard all her life, and she threw herself into the work gratefully, needing something to occupy her hands and her mind while she adjusted to this strange new world. The days developed a rhythm. Grace woke early and helped Martha prepare breakfast for the men. After they left for their work, she and Martha would tackle the household tasks, working side by side while Martha told stories about the ranch and the area and the people in Carson City. In the evenings, they would all gather for dinner, and Lincoln would tell Grace about the ranch, asking her opinion on small matters and gradually including her more fully in the life of the place. Grace found herself watching Lincoln whenever she thought he was not looking, noticing the way he moved with unconscious grace, the way his hands were both strong and gentle when he handled tools or animals, the way his face lit up when he smiled. He was patient with her, answering her endless questions about ranch life without making her feel foolish, and he had a quiet sense of humor that emerged in unexpected moments. One evening, about 2 weeks after her arrival, Grace was helping Martha prepare dinner when she heard shouting from outside. She ran to the window and saw Lincoln and James struggling with a cow that had somehow gotten tangled in a section of fence. The animal was panicking, thrashing against the wires that held it, and even from the house Grace could see that the situation was dangerous. Without thinking, she grabbed her coat and ran outside, ignoring Martha's call to wait. She reached the fence just as Lincoln was trying to approach the cow from one side while James attempted to cut the wire from the other. The animal kicked out, and Lincoln had to jump back to avoid being struck. "What can I do?" Grace called. Lincoln looked up, startled to see her there. "Stay back. She is dangerous when she is frightened like this." "I can help," Grace insisted. "Tell me what to do." Lincoln hesitated, then made a decision. "All right, come around to this side, but move slowly. I need you to talk to her. Keep her attention on you while James and I work on the wire. Can you do that?" Grace nodded and moved carefully to where Lincoln indicated. She had never been particularly close to a cow before, but she understood fear when she saw it in the animal's rolling eyes. She began to speak in a low, soothing voice, the way her mother used to speak to her when she was frightened as a child. She talked about nothing and everything, just letting the sound of her voice flow over the panicked creature, while Lincoln and James worked quickly to free the tangled legs. It seemed to take forever, but finally the last wire was cut, and the cow stumbled free, favoring one leg but mobile. Lincoln and James herded it toward the barn while Grace stood by the ruined fence, her heart pounding with delayed fear and exhilaration. Lincoln returned a few minutes later, his face serious. "That was foolish," he said, but there was no real anger in his voice. "You could have been hurt." "So could you," Grace replied, "and I wanted to help." He looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable in his eyes. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. "You did well. She calmed considerably when you started talking to her. Thank you." They walked back to the house together through the cold evening air, and Grace was acutely aware of Lincoln walking beside her, of the space between them that suddenly felt charged with possibility. She realized that she was no longer afraid of him, had not been afraid for some time now. Instead, she found herself drawn to him in ways she was only beginning to understand. That night, lying in her bed, Grace acknowledged to herself what she had been avoiding thinking about too directly. She was falling in love with Lincoln Quincy. It was not the wild, passionate love she had read about in the few novels that had passed through her hands over the years. It was something quieter and steadier, built on daily interactions and growing trust, and the way her heart lifted whenever he entered a room. She did not know if he felt the same way about her, but she found herself hoping desperately that he did. Winter deepened, and the world outside became a landscape of white and gray and stunning blue skies. Grace learned to bake bread that rose properly, to manage the temperamental stove, to mend shirts and darn socks, and do 100 other tasks that kept a household running. She learned the names of all the horses and cattle, learned to read the weather in the sky and the behavior of the animals, learned the rhythms of this life so different from anything she had known before. And she learned Lincoln. She learned that he was an early riser who liked to watch the sunrise while drinking his first cup of coffee. She learned that he read at night, slowly working his way through a small collection of books that had belonged to his father. She learned that he had a beautiful singing voice that he only used when he thought no one was listening, crooning old ballads to the horses while he worked. She learned that he was scrupulously fair with his men, that he gave credit where it was due and took responsibility for mistakes, that he worked harder than anyone else on the ranch and never asked others to do what he would not do himself. She also learned, slowly and through careful observation, that he was watching her too. She caught him looking at her sometimes with an expression of such tenderness that it made her breath catch. He found excuses to be near her, to teach her things or show her parts of the ranch, and his fingers would linger when he helped her over rough ground or handed her down from a wagon. He asked her opinion on matters both small and large, and he listened to her answers as if they truly mattered to him. February arrived, bringing with it a brief warm spell that melted some of the snow and turned the roads to mud. Lincoln announced one morning that he needed to go into Carson City for supplies and asked if Grace would like to accompany him. She agreed eagerly, curious to see the town properly in daylight and without the veil of fear and cold that had obscured her first impression. They set out after breakfast in the ranch wagon, with James driving and Lincoln and Grace sitting in the back among the empty supply crates. The road was rough, and Grace found herself jostled against Lincoln more than once, each contact sending little sparks of awareness through her body. He steadied her with a hand on her arm, his touch warm even through layers of clothing, and she saw color rise in his cheeks that had nothing to do with the cold. Carson City in daylight was a bustling frontier town, full of miners and merchants and cowboys and families trying to make lives for themselves in this harsh country. They stopped first at the general store, where Lincoln introduced Grace to the proprietor, a jovial man named Mr. Hendricks, who insisted on showing her his entire stock and offering her peppermint sticks from a jar on the counter. "So you are the mail-order bride we heard about," Mr. Hendricks said cheerfully. "Whole town has been curious about you. Lincoln is lucky to have found such a pretty young lady willing to come all this way." Grace felt herself blushing, but Lincoln spoke up before she could respond. "I am the lucky one, that is certain," he said quietly, and the sincerity in his voice made her heart skip. They spent the morning visiting various shops and businesses, picking up supplies and chatting with townspeople who were friendly and welcoming. Grace met the doctor, an elderly man named Dr. Brennan, who had practiced in Carson City for 30 years, and the schoolteacher, a sharp-eyed woman named Miss Sullivan who was close to Grace's own age. Several women invited Grace to a quilting circle that met weekly at the church, and she found herself accepting, surprised by how easily she was being folded into this community. At noon, Lincoln suggested they have lunch at the hotel dining room before starting back. They sat at a table by the window, overlooking the main street, and ordered roast chicken and vegetables. The dining room was half full, mostly with businessmen and a few families, and Grace felt sophisticated and grown up sitting there with Lincoln, as if they were a real couple instead of two people still figuring out whether they belonged together. "You were wonderful today," Lincoln said as they waited for their food. "The way you spoke with everyone, the interest you showed. People responded to you." "They were kind," Grace said. "Kinder than I expected, honestly. I thought there might be judgment about the circumstances of my arrival." Lincoln shook his head. "This is frontier country. Most people here came from somewhere else, looking for new opportunities or fresh starts. They understand that life takes people down unexpected paths." He paused, then continued more softly, "Grace, I want you to know that I am very glad you came. These past weeks have been good ones for me. The house feels more like a home with you in it." Grace's heart was beating very fast. "It has been good for me too," she admitted. "Better than I hoped it could be. I was so frightened that day at the depot, Lincoln. Frightened of the cold and the strangeness and of you, honestly. But you have been nothing but kind and patient, and I am grateful." "You do not need to be grateful," Lincoln said, reaching across the table to take her hand. It was the first time he had touched her in such an openly affectionate way, and Grace felt the contact like electricity. "I want you to be happy here. I want you to feel like this is your home, not just a place where you are staying." "I am starting to," Grace whispered. "Feel like it is home, I mean." Their food arrived then, interrupting the moment, but Lincoln kept hold of her hand for a few seconds longer before releasing it. They ate and talked about small things, and Grace felt as if they had crossed some invisible threshold, moving from cautious acquaintances to something more. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, both of them lost in thought. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple, and the world looked beautiful and full of promise. When they arrived home and Lincoln helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingered on her waist and his eyes searched her face as if looking for answers to questions he had not yet asked. March arrived with warming temperatures and the first hints of green appearing in sheltered spots. The ranch exploded into activity as calving season began, and Lincoln spent long days and nights in the barns and pastures, helping cows through difficult births and making sure the new calves survived their vulnerable first days. Grace found herself helping too, bringing food and coffee to the men, watching over newborns while Lincoln tended to other animals, and gradually learning the signs that indicated when a cow was in distress. One night, she was in the barn with Lincoln, watching him help a young heifer with her first calf. The birth was difficult, and Grace could see the strain on both the cow and on Lincoln as he worked to turn the calf into the proper position. She stood by with clean towels and warm water, handing him what he needed when he asked, and offering encouragement to the laboring animal. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the calf slid free in a rush of fluid. Lincoln caught it and quickly cleared its nose and mouth, and within moments it was breathing on its own. The mother cow, exhausted but attentive, began to lick her baby clean while Lincoln sat back on his heels, breathing hard. "Is she all right?" Grace asked, kneeling beside him. "The calf, I mean. She is perfect," Lincoln said, and his voice was full of wonder despite having seen this miracle countless times before. "Look at her trying to stand already. Strong little thing." They watched together as the calf made several wobbly attempts to get her legs under her, finally succeeding in standing upright where she swayed but held steady. The mother continued her attentive cleaning, making soft sounds that seemed designed to encourage her baby. "This is what I love about ranching," Lincoln said quietly. "Moments like this when all the hard work and worry pay off in new life. It never gets old." Grace looked at his profile in the lamplight, saw the genuine joy on his face, and felt her love for him swell until it seemed to fill her entire chest. "Lincoln," she said softly, and he turned to look at her. Something must have shown on her face because his expression changed, became more intense. "Grace," he said, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer. "I need to tell you something. I have been trying to wait to give you time, but I cannot hold it in any longer." Her heart was pounding so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. "What is it?" "I am falling in love with you," Lincoln said simply. "I think I have been since the moment I saw you at the depot, looking so brave and so frightened at the same time. Every day since then has only made it stronger. The way you laugh at Martha's stories, the way you talk to the animals, the way you tackle every new challenge without complaint. You are everything I hoped for, and things I did not even know to hope for. I love you, Grace, and I want to marry you, not out of convenience or necessity, but because I cannot imagine my life without you in it." Tears sprang to Grace's eyes, but they were happy tears. "I love you too," she whispered. "I was afraid to say it, afraid it was too soon or that you might not feel the same way. But I do, Lincoln. I love you so much." He reached for her then, pulling her close, and kissed her for the first time. His lips were warm and gentle against hers, and Grace felt as if she was finally, truly home. The kiss deepened, becoming more passionate, and when they finally broke apart they were both breathing hard. "Marry me," Lincoln said against her hair. "Please, Grace, be my wife in truth." "Yes," Grace said without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you." They stayed in the barn a while longer, holding each other and making plans, while the new calf nursed for the first time and the patient mother looked on. Finally, they walked back to the house hand in hand, and Martha took one look at their faces and burst into delighted tears. "Finally," she exclaimed. "I thought you two would dance around each other forever. When is the wedding?" "As soon as it can be arranged," Lincoln said firmly. "I have waited long enough for happiness. I do not intend to wait any longer than necessary." They were married 3 weeks later, on a bright April morning when the world was finally shaking off winter's grip and bursting into spring. The ceremony took place in the small church in Carson City, with half the town in attendance. Grace wore a dress that the ladies of the quilting circle had made for her, ivory silk trimmed with lace, and she carried wildflowers that Lincoln had picked for her that morning. Martha cried through the entire ceremony, and James stood up as Lincoln's best man with obvious pride. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife and Lincoln kissed her in front of all those witnesses, Grace felt a joy so profound that it seemed impossible that she had once been the frightened girl shivering at the depot. That girl felt like someone from another lifetime, and in a way, she was. Grace had been reborn here in this wild country, had discovered strengths and capabilities she never knew she possessed, and had found a love that felt as vast and enduring as the mountains themselves. The wedding celebration continued at the ranch, with tables set up in the yard and food enough to feed an army. There was music and dancing and laughter, and Grace danced with Lincoln under the open sky while their friends and neighbors looked on with approval. As the sun set and the stars began to emerge, Lincoln led her away from the crowd, and they walked together to a rise overlooking the ranch. "This is ours now," Lincoln said, his arm around her waist. "All of it. Everything I have built, everything I hope to build in the future, it is yours as much as mine. We are partners in this, Grace. Equal partners." "I know," Grace said, leaning into his warmth. "And I promise I will work as hard as you do to make this place thrive. We will build a good life here, Lincoln. A life we can be proud of." That night, when they finally retired to the room that was now theirs together, Lincoln was tender and patient with Grace's inexperience. He took his time, making sure she felt safe and cherished, and when they finally came together as husband and wife, Grace felt as if some final piece of herself had clicked into place. This was where she belonged. This was home. The months that followed were full of work and discovery and deepening love. Grace threw herself into ranch life with determination, learning to ride properly so she could accompany Lincoln when he checked on the far pastures. She took over more of the household management from Martha, who was increasingly troubled by arthritis in her hands. She planted a vegetable garden that flourished in the high desert sun and began keeping chickens for eggs and meat. She befriended the women in town, attended church socials and quilting circles, and gradually built a network of friendships that enriched her life in ways she had not anticipated. And through it all, there was Lincoln, her husband, her partner, her love. They worked side by side during the day and fell into each other's arms at night, and Grace could not imagine ever having been happier. They had their disagreements, of course, moments when fatigue or stress made them snap at each other, but they learned to talk through their problems, to apologize when they were wrong and forgive when they were wronged. Their love grew deeper and more complex, built on foundation of respect and genuine affection. In October, Grace realized she was pregnant. She told Lincoln one evening after dinner, pulling him aside and whispering the news. For a moment he just stared at her, processing, and then his face broke into the biggest smile she had ever seen. He picked her up and spun her around, laughing with pure joy, and then set her down carefully as if she might break. "Are you happy?" Grace asked, suddenly nervous despite his obvious pleasure. "Happy?" Lincoln pulled her close, his hand coming to rest on her still flat belly. "Grace, I am more than happy. I am overwhelmed. A baby, our baby. This is everything I wanted but never let myself fully hope for." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the fall and into winter. Grace continued to work as much as she could, though Lincoln fretted constantly about her doing too much. She reassured him that women had babies while running ranches all the time, and that she would let him know if she needed to slow down. Martha was delighted, already making plans for baby clothes and supplies, and Grace found herself surrounded by a community of women who offered advice and support. In early May, on a warm spring evening when the air was full of the scent of sagebrush and new grass, Grace went into labor. Lincoln sent James racing to town for the doctor, while Martha took charge of the bedroom, heating water and laying out clean linens. The labor was long and hard, and there were moments when Grace thought she could not endure another minute of the pain, but Lincoln stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand and offering encouragement even when she snapped at him to be quiet. Finally, as the sun was rising over the mountains, Grace gave birth to a healthy baby boy with a head of dark hair and lungs that announced his displeasure at being born in no uncertain terms. Lincoln held his son with shaking hands, tears streaming down his face, and looked at Grace with such love and awe that she felt her own tears begin to fall. "He is perfect," Lincoln whispered. "Absolutely perfect. Thank you, Grace. Thank you for this incredible gift." They named him Thomas, after Lincoln's father, and he became the center of their world. Lincoln was a devoted father, getting up for nighttime feedings and changing diapers without complaint, marveling at every tiny milestone as Thomas grew. Grace watched her husband with their son and fell in love with him all over again, seeing new depths to the man she had married. The ranch continued to thrive. They hired additional hands as the herd grew, and Lincoln began buying more land, expanding their holdings. Grace proved to have a head for numbers, and she took over managing the ranch accounts, discovering ways to economize without sacrificing quality. They became known in the area as fair employers and honest dealers, and their reputation brought them opportunities for partnerships and sales. When Thomas was 2 years old, Grace became pregnant again. This time she carried a girl, born in late winter during a rare snowstorm that reminded Grace of the day she had arrived in Carson City. They named her Alina, after Grace's mother, and she had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn determination. Life settled into a rhythm of seasons and growth. The children grew strong and healthy, learning to ride almost before they could walk properly, helping with age-appropriate chores as soon as they were able. Thomas developed his father's quiet competence and love of animals, while Alina showed signs of having inherited her mother's organizational skills and her father's head for business. Martha continued to live with them until she passed peacefully in her sleep one winter night, nearly 10 years after Grace's arrival. They buried her in the small cemetery outside Carson City, and Grace mourned her as she would have mourned her own mother, grateful for the kindness and wisdom Martha had shared so freely. More children came over the years. Another boy they named Samuel, and finally twins, a boy and girl they named James and Caroline after dear friends. The house seemed to burst with noise and life, with children running through rooms that had once been quiet, with laughter and occasional tears, and all the chaos of a large family. Grace sometimes thought about that frightened girl who had stepped off the stage coach so many years ago, half frozen and terrified of what the future might hold. She could hardly believe that girl had been her, so different did her life look now. She had found not just a home but a purpose, not just a husband but a true partner, not just safety but genuine happiness. One evening, nearly 15 years after her arrival, Grace and Lincoln stood together on the same rise where they had stood on their wedding night. Their children were in the house with the housekeeper they had hired to help manage the growing household, and for once they had a moment of peace and quiet. "You ever regret it?" Lincoln asked, pulling her close. "Answering that advertisement, coming all this way to marry a stranger." Grace turned in his arms to look up at him, this man she loved more with each passing year. Not for a single moment, she said truthfully. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had made a different choice, stayed in Boston or gone somewhere else. But then I look at our life, at our children, at everything we have built together, and I know that this was always where I was meant to be. I am the one who should be grateful, Lincoln said, kissing her forehead. You took a leap of faith, trusting a man you had never met. You could have had a much easier life somewhere else. Easier maybe, but not better, Grace said firmly. Not nearly as full or as rich or as meaningful. You kept your promise, Lincoln. You said fear ends at your door, and you were right. I have not been truly afraid since that day, because I know that whatever challenges we face them together. They stood there as the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant colors, and watched the land they had nurtured and fought for and loved spread out before them. The ranch was thriving, their children were healthy and happy, and the love between them had only grown stronger with time and testing. In the house behind them, Grace could hear the sounds of their children laughing as they played some game before bedtime. In the barns, the animals were settling for the night. In the bunkhouse, the ranch hands were finishing their evening meal and preparing for another early morning. Everything was as it should be, the intricate machinery of their life running smoothly, because they had built it with care and intention. I love you, Lincoln said quietly, and even after all these years, the words still had the power to make Grace's heart skip. I love you too, she replied. Always. As they walked back to the house hand in hand, Grace reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She had traveled across a continent seeking safety and stability, and had found instead a love story she never could have imagined. The Wild West had been harsh and unforgiving at times, testing her in ways she had never expected, but it had also been generous, offering opportunities and experiences she never could have had in her old life. The mail-order bride who had arrived frozen and afraid had transformed into a rancher's wife, a mother, a businesswoman, and a beloved member of her community. She had learned to thrive in this hard country, had discovered reserves of strength and capability she never knew she possessed. And at the center of it all was Lincoln, the cowboy who had promised that fear ends at his door and had spent every day since proving that promise true. Years continued to pass in a blur of seasons and milestones. Thomas grew into a young man who took after his father in temperament and skill, managing more and more of the ranch operations as Lincoln gradually stepped back. Eleanor married a doctor who had come to Carson City fresh from medical school back east, and they settled in town where she became a leading figure in civic improvement efforts. Samuel showed an unexpected talent for horses, developing a side business training and selling quality mounts that became renowned throughout the territory. The twins, James and Caroline, were still finding their paths, but showed promise in their own ways. Grace and Lincoln became grandparents, a development that filled them both with joy and astonishment at how quickly time had passed. They would sit on the porch in the evenings, watching their grandchildren play in the yard where their own children had played, and marvel at the life they had built. Nevada achieved statehood during their early years together, and they watched as Carson City grew from a rough frontier town into a proper capital city. They saw the railroad arrive, saw telephone lines strung between buildings, saw automobiles begin to replace horses on the streets. The world was changing rapidly, but the ranch remained a constant, a place where life still moved according to the rhythms of seasons and the needs of animals and land. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Lincoln surprised Grace with a trip to San Francisco. It was her first time seeing the ocean, and she stood on the beach with tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by the beauty and vastness of it. They stayed for a week, seeing shows and visiting restaurants and exploring the city like excited children. But as wonderful as it was, Grace found herself eager to return home, to the ranch and the life they had made. "I used to dream about seeing grand cities and far-off places," she told Lincoln on the train ride back. "But now I realize that the grandest adventure of my life has been right there on that ranch, building something real and lasting with you." Lincoln squeezed her hand. "We have been blessed," he agreed, "more than we probably deserve." Martha's old room had been converted into a library of sorts, filled with books and comfortable chairs where family members could retreat for quiet reading. Grace spent many hours there, especially in winter, and it was in that room that she began writing down the story of her life. She wanted her grandchildren and great-grandchildren to know where they came from, to understand the courage it had taken to leave everything familiar and venture into the unknown, to appreciate the love and hard work that had built the foundation they now stood on. She wrote about the terror of that first day in Carson City, about the moment Lincoln had promised that fear ends at his door, and how she had clung to those words like a lifeline. She wrote about learning to love him, about the gradual unfolding of trust and affection into something deep and unshakable. She wrote about the births of their children, about losses and triumphs, about the thousand small moments that had woven together to create a life. When she finished, years later, she had filled several journals with her careful handwriting. She gave them to Alina, who had always been the most interested in family history, and made her promise to preserve them for future generations. "This is important, Mother," Alina said, carefully turning the pages. "You should consider having these published. Other women might find inspiration in your story." Grace shook her head. "I did not write it for strangers. I wrote it for us, for our family, so they would know their history." She smiled. "Though I suppose if it helps someone else find courage to take a leap of faith, that would be a good thing too." Lincoln's health began to decline when he was in his late 60s. Nothing dramatic, just the accumulation of decades of hard physical labor taking its toll. His joints ached in cold weather. His stamina was not what it once was, and he moved more slowly and carefully. He resisted admitting these changes at first, stubborn about maintaining his independence, but Grace gently insisted that he let their sons take on more of the heavy work. "You have earned a rest," she told him firmly. "Let Thomas and Samuel handle the hard labor. You can still oversee things, make the important decisions, but you do not need to be mucking out stalls or mending fences anymore." Grudgingly, Lincoln agreed, and found that he actually enjoyed having more time to spend with Grace, with his grandchildren, with the land itself, rather than the endless labor of maintaining it. They took long, slow rides together through the property, pointing out changes and remembering stories from earlier days. They sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the sunset and talking about everything and nothing. They made love less frequently, but with no less passion, their bodies knowing each other so well that words were often unnecessary. Grace herself was aging too, her dark hair now heavily streaked with gray, her face lined with the marks of years spent in the sun and wind. Her hands, once so soft from factory work, were calloused and capable, able to turn to any task. She moved with the confidence of a woman who knew her own worth, who had proven herself in countless ways over the course of her life. On a warm June evening, 30 years after Grace had first arrived in Carson City, they hosted a celebration at the ranch. All 5 of their children were there with their spouses and children, along with grandchildren who were starting to have children of their own. Ranch hands past and present came, as did friends from town and neighboring ranches. Tables groaned under the weight of food, and music filled the air. Thomas stood up to make a toast. "To my parents," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "Who built this ranch from almost nothing through sheer determination and love. Who taught us the value of hard work and honesty and treating people fairly. Who showed us what real partnership looks like in a marriage. We are all blessed to be part of what you created, and we promise to honor your legacy by carrying it forward into the future." Everyone raised their glasses, and Grace felt tears slip down her cheeks. She looked around at all these people, this family they had created, this community they had nurtured, and felt a profound sense of satisfaction. They had done it. They had taken a chance on each other, two strangers brought together by circumstance and advertisement, and had built something beautiful and enduring. Lincoln leaned over and kissed her temple. "No regrets," he whispered. "Not a single one," Grace whispered back. "You." "Only that I cannot live it all over again," Lincoln said. "But I would not change a single moment, even the hard ones. They all led us here." As the celebration continued around them, they slipped away to their favorite spot on the rise overlooking the ranch. The sun was setting in a blaze of orange and gold, and the land spread out before them in all its harsh beauty. This land that had tested them and rewarded them, that had shaped them into the people they had become. "Fear ends at my door," Lincoln said softly, repeating the words he had spoken so long ago. "I meant it then, and I mean it now. As long as I draw breath, you will be safe and loved and cherished." "I know," Grace said simply, leaning into his warmth. "I have always known. From the very beginning, even when I was too frightened to fully believe it, some part of me knew that you were a man of your word, that you would keep me safe, that you would love me well." They stood there as the sun dipped below the mountains, and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. In the distance, they could hear the sounds of their family, laughter and conversation and music blending together in a symphony of life and love. The ranch that had been Lincoln's alone was now a family legacy, something that would continue long after they were gone. And Grace, who had once been a frightened girl stepping off a stagecoach into an unknown future, who had answered an advertisement out of desperation and hope, had found everything she had ever dreamed of and so much more. She had found a home, a purpose, a family, and a love that had sustained her through 3 decades of joys and sorrows, triumphs and setbacks. The Wild West had been wild indeed, full of challenges and hardships that would have broken a lesser woman. But Grace had not broken. She had bent and adapted and grown stronger, supported always by the man who stood beside her now, the cowboy who had promised that fear ends at his door and had spent their entire marriage making good on that promise. As they walked back to the house together, moving more slowly now than they once had but still hand in hand, still together, Grace thought about all the women who might be reading matrimonial advertisements at this very moment, weighing their options, trying to decide whether to take a leap of faith into the unknown. She hoped they found what she had found. She hoped they discovered that courage was not the absence of fear but the decision to move forward despite it. She hoped they learned that love could be built as well as found, that partnership and respect could grow into passion, that happiness was something you created through daily choices and commitments. The celebration continued late into the night, but eventually the guests began to depart, heading home to their own lives and loves. The children and grandchildren settled into various rooms throughout the house, the ranch quiet at last, except for the usual sounds of animals and wind and the creaking of boards settling. Lincoln and Grace lay in their bed, the same bed they had shared for 30 years, and held each other close. They talked quietly about the evening, about how big the great-grandchildren had gotten, about repairs that needed to be made to the barn roof before winter, about plans for next year's planting. Ordinary conversation about ordinary things, the fabric of a life shared. "I love you," Grace said, as she said every night. "I love you too," Lincoln replied as he replied every night. "Sleep well, my dear heart." Grace closed her eyes and felt peace settle over her like a warm blanket. She had come so far from that frozen, frightened girl at the depot. She had crossed a continent and crossed over into a new version of herself, had discovered strengths and capabilities she never knew she possessed. She had loved and been loved in return, had created life and nurtured it, had built something that would outlast her own days. The years continued their steady march. Lincoln passed away in his sleep one winter night at the age of 74, with Grace beside him holding his hand. She mourned him deeply, as did their children and grandchildren and everyone who had known him. They buried him on a hill overlooking the ranch he had loved, with a simple stone that read Lincoln Quincy, husband, father, friend. He kept his word. Grace lived on for another 7 years, still active and engaged despite her advancing age. She helped Alina organize the town library, advised Thomas on ranch management, doted on her great-grandchildren, and continued to write in her journals, adding new chapters to the family history. She spoke often of Lincoln, keeping his memory alive through stories and reminiscences, making sure the younger generations understood what kind of man he had been. On a warm spring morning, very much like the morning of their wedding day all those decades ago, Grace passed away peacefully in her sleep. She was 82 years old, and she had lived a full and remarkable life. They buried her beside Lincoln, and her stone read Grace Kellerman Quincy, wife, mother, pioneer. Fear ended at his door and love began. The ranch continued under Thomas's management, then passed to his son, carrying forward the legacy that Grace and Lincoln had built together. The house was maintained carefully, with Grace's journals preserved in the library and photographs of the family displayed throughout. Future generations grew up hearing stories about the mail-order bride who had arrived frozen and afraid, and the cowboy who had promised her safety and given her love instead. And so the story ended not with an ending at all, but with a continuation, a legacy that rippled forward through time. Two people who had taken a chance on each other, who had chosen courage over fear and love over loneliness, had created something that would endure long after they were gone. In a wild land that tested everyone who tried to tame it, they had found each other and held on tight, building a life of meaning and purpose and profound connection. Grace's words, written in those careful journals, were eventually published by one of her great-granddaughters, and they did indeed inspire other women facing difficult choices. Her story became a testament to the power of courage, the possibility of transformation, and the enduring nature of love built on partnership and respect. The mail-order bride who had arrived in Carson City on that frozen January day in 1883 had found exactly what she had been seeking, though she had not known to seek it in quite that form. She had found a home in the truest sense of the word, not just a physical place but a state of being where she was known and valued and cherished. She had found work that gave her purpose and satisfaction. She had found a community that embraced her. And most importantly, she had found a love that transformed her understanding of what love could be. Lincoln's promise that fear ends at his door had not been an empty one. It had been a vow that he kept every single day of their marriage, through his actions and his words and his unwavering commitment to her happiness and well-being. He had given her the safety and security she needed to flourish, and in return she had given him the partnership and love he had been seeking. Together, they had been so much more than either of them could have been alone, and that, in the end, was the real story. Not just a tale of a mail-order bride and a lonely cowboy, but a story of two people who recognized in each other the possibility of something better, something richer, something worth fighting for. They had taken that possibility and nurtured it through all the seasons of their lives, through joy and sorrow, through abundance and scarcity, through youth and age. They had created not just a marriage but a true partnership, not just a family but a legacy, not just a life but an example of what was possible when courage and love walked hand in hand. The Wild West was indeed wild, harsh and unforgiving and full of danger. But it was also a place where new beginnings were possible, where people could reinvent themselves, where love could bloom in the most unlikely circumstances. Grace and Lincoln's story was one of many such stories that played out across the frontier, but it was unique in its particulars, in the specific way these two individuals found and cherished each other. And so their story lived on, told and retold, written down and preserved, a testament to the enduring human capacity for hope and courage and love. The ranch they built still stood, modified and modernized but still recognizably the same place where Grace had first learned to be truly unafraid. The family they created continued to grow and branch out, carrying forward the values and lessons they had modeled. The love they shared became a benchmark against which later generations measured their own relationships. In the end, Grace's journey from that frozen depot to the rich, full life she lived was more than just one woman's story. It was a story about the possibilities that exist when we are brave enough to step into the unknown, when we are willing to trust despite our fears, when we open ourselves to connection and love. It was a story about the Wild West not just as a place, but as an idea, a frontier where anything was possible for those bold enough to reach for it. And it all began with a cowboy's promise: "Fear ends at my door." 5 simple words that changed everything, that offered shelter not just from the physical cold, but from all the fears and worries that had plagued Grace's earlier life. Lincoln had meant those words, had backed them up with action every single day, and in doing so had given Grace the foundation she needed to become the woman she was meant to be. Their love story was not without its challenges, but those challenges only served to strengthen their bond, to prove over and over that they were truly partners in every sense of the word. They faced financial difficulties, harsh weather, illness, loss, and all the ordinary trials of life, but they faced them together, drawing strength from each other and from the commitment they had made. Now, long after both of them had passed from this world, their story remained as a reminder of what was possible when two people truly committed to each other, when they chose partnership over independence, when they built something together that was greater than the sum of its parts. The ranch stood as a physical monument to their work and vision, but the real monument was the family they had created, the love they had shared, and the example they had set for all who came after. Grace Kellerman, who had boarded that stagecoach in Boston as a desperate young woman with few options and little hope, had lived a life beyond her wildest dreams. She had known true love, had raised healthy children, had been respected in her community, had made a real difference in the world around her. And it had all started with one act of courage: answering an advertisement and trusting that the man who wrote it might be worthy of her trust. Lincoln Quincy, who had placed that advertisement out of loneliness and practical need, had received far more than he had asked for. He had found not just a housekeeper or helpmate, but a true partner, a woman who matched him in strength and determination, who brought new dimensions to his life he had never imagined. Together, they had created something beautiful and enduring out of the harsh materials of frontier life. And so their story concluded not with sadness but with satisfaction, not with endings but with continuations. They had lived well and loved well, and that was the greatest achievement any person could hope for. The Wild West had been their crucible, testing and refining them, and they had emerged triumphant, having built a life and a love that stood as an example for generations to come. Fear had indeed ended at Lincoln's door, and in its place, love had grown and flourished beyond measure.